everybody. I know y'all probably like, what are you doing on here in the middle of the week? Well, y'all know I teach in New York. We are off for Lunar New Year, the Chinese New Year. We didn't have it off last year or ever before, but they didn't do street sweeping today and we got out of school. So I'm just going to do this. I know that things are hectic. I know that there are programs that have been frozen and the judge recently stopped the freezing, declaring, it unlawful, unconstitutional. And the bottom line is the majority of the country, despite how close the race was, voted for this shit. That being said, my motto, as it comes from Reverend Henry Highland Garnett in the 19th century when he was appealing to the enslaved Africans and to Black people throughout the country, resist, resist, resist. I don't care what happens, do not capitulate to white supremacy, to racism, to lies that teach you you are inherently inferior. They are certainly coming for education. The fact that they're coming for the 14th Amendment are the things that come with citizenship rights that was based on us as people who were formerly enslaved and moving into citizenship. The 14th Amendment was passed while the Confederate States had to prove why they should be let back into the Union because creating a confederacy was illegal and treasonous. And so they were therefore forced out of Congress until further notice. That's when we got the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. We know about the technicalities around that, but you get it. 14th Amendment, which gives everybody born on American soil the right to citizenship. And finally, 15th Amendment, which was supposed to give Black men and protect their right to vote. And white women went off the rails, talking about, well, y'all going to give these Sambos right to vote when y'all own them and not us. Meanwhile, white women could vote in Western states. It just wasn't a federally protected law. Black women don't get federal protection for voting rights until 1965. Nevertheless, resist, resist, resist. And that's why I'm on here today. Because they come for a part of citizenship is having the right to education. And education is something I believe everybody should have access to. And certainly the people I think should have the most access to it for a reason are the people that are consistently denied it. And in this case, in this country, it has been African Americans. And they will take any token minority that is non-Black or using people who have immigrated or had first generation Americans, be they Nigerian, be they Mexican, but they come from a different culture and won't challenge the US government in the same way. And regardless, because I know it's a tool, right? Because we're seeing that. We're seeing that with ICE raids and things like that. But my point is, the more you know about your own history, the further you can go. And as corny as that sounds, it's like Marcus Garvey when he said a person with no history or knowledge of the history is like a tree without roots. You don't know where you're going, you can't stand. All right. So I'm going to try to do this today. I'm not going to do a lot of it because I know that a lot of people really only kind of want to escape from that, from the realities of what's happening in our society. And I get it, but I'm also someone who, believes that there's an empowerment in learning education, particularly history, as I am someone who studied it for a very long time. So this is something I put together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Black power in education. I'm not going to go all the way through it because I just don't think I'm a big Black history buff, especially Black History Month coming up. Here we go. All right. So I'm not going to even start at Reconstruction when there were Black women, in particular, Black men, building schools physically just for African American children to learn. We don't even have to go back that far. So the transformation in the freedom struggle, the Black freedom struggle, also known as the Civil Rights Movement, was the building of things called freedom schools, which is where they educated adults and children on their citizenship rights and making sure they had a sense of their history, so on and so forth. And the citizenship schools were really primarily for adults so they could learn how to vote and learn what the laws were so they know what they were voting for. Now, there comes a shift in the mid-1960s when the growing struggle for Black rights becomes more militant, quite frankly. They were no longer preoccupied by the mid-1960s about the moral redemption, if you will, of American society. Many activists adopted organizing strategies designed to revolutionize Black culture and consciousness. So during the mid to late 1960s, autonomous Black education reflected these ideological shifts. We've asked them to reorganize funding for our education, and that did happen for a little bit with the Great Society that Lyndon B. Johnson funded, but then switched all that money over to Vietnam. Sound familiar? Because that's kind of what's happening now. All right. And so they decide they wanted to redefine what mass revolt looked like. This is a group. I mean, Black people, once again, are very different. And where you live in this country can kind of help your struggle form this way or that way. Okay. But nevertheless, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in 1965, one of the things they did was they created a Black History Primer. And if you don't know what a primer is, it's basically an elementary like textbook for any subject. And it serves as an introduction to a particular thing. And it's used for teaching children, or it's used for teaching somebody who knows nothing about it. So they create a Black History Primer. These are the people you need to know. These are the things you should be aware of and know about your own history in order just to get your footing as you move forward, learning about who you are, so you can self-actualize, as an African-American, at that point, Afro-American, so on and so forth. So on one hand, the primer that SNCC did, which was really heavily Black college students, a younger generation. On one hand, the primer was reminiscent of the Northern and Southern freedom schools. Like they learned from these people, right? They learned from these older people in the civil rights movement, and older in the civil rights movement also meant like late 30s, okay? But nevertheless, which had cast Black Americans as these sort of inheritors of national liberty. Like they had a right to it. But the 1965 primer that SNCC comes up with was a publication that placed the Black movement within the liberal tradition of the American Revolution. And I'm sure you're like, well, how does that even match? The booklet points out and a set of critiques asking, why does the United States support dictators and racists in other countries? And as machines put more and more people out of work, what will these people do? The very origins of the primer suggested growing militancy. They understood that technological advancements then were already going to start putting the working class, the working poor, further into poverty because you're already replacing them and you're not teaching them the skill set to be technologically savvy and advanced. And they saw that. Instead, they felt like, yes, education is something, but we also need to know how to fight to preserve ourselves. It's celebrated when they do that in the American Revolution. When Black people do the same thing, like James Baldwin said, then it's a problem. All right. Now, where am I going with all this? They start looking for ways. And the thing is, I feel like people often feel when we're talking about African-American history, somebody always feels the need to take a side. Is it Malcolm X or is it Martin Luther King? If you had followed Martin Luther King's trajectory and actually, really sat down and read Martin Luther King stuff, I don't know why y'all have allowed white people to take that last minute and a half of the I Have a Dream speech and truncate it to you like he was just going around begging white people. Please. Martin Luther King was not like that at all. At all. And that's when I can tell people haven't read. There is something to gain from both of them. And a lot to gain from both of them. And it's not for me, the Black Panthers or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It doesn't have to be. They've already done that heavy lifting historically. It's our job to learn from it. Anyway, so SNCC, once again, run by Black college students, they eventually put all the white people out. They start, and the organization splits, though, whether white people should be allowed in it or not, because there's some people like, they don't get what we're doing. They think they can come in and talk to us like we need their help. Why don't they go back out into their white community and talk to white people? Because those are the people we can't get through to. Now, see, I can rock with that. Nevertheless, so SNCC ventures that summer to do some real work around education and the differences in the North and in the South, because many of them were obviously historically Black college students, most of which are in the South. But many of them had come from up North, and they were trying to articulate, some of these differences. And maybe if Black people had more of a grasp on what's happening in other regions, maybe we could unify ourselves more collectively. Because a lot of times they really don't understand how some of these things are operating. So the project they come up with really looked at the complexities of contemporary politics, and they wanted to confront it. Poverty in the inner city, poverty in the sharecropping neighborhoods. All throughout the South, right? So they took one group of high school teenagers from Cordell, Georgia, and then they took another group of teenagers from the South Side of Chicago. Bold, yes, but nevertheless, okay. To spend almost 2 months living together in each location while exploring the realities. So you had these South Side of Chicago kids get sent to racist as segregated as Cordell, Georgia, right? All of them do it at the same time, which is kind of an interesting idea because you have teenagers who would need each other's help. Because somebody down south, because I remember having to tell my roommate this, who was from Detroit, like, don't react like that. I know. I totally get why you're pissed off. I totally get why you are still cursing from the time we were on. And yes, I know some of these Black people are just completely submissive to whiteness, and I realize why you're pissed. But I'm just telling you, that can't be your reaction all the time. And it's because in the South, you do have a different reality of how crazy these motherfuckers get. And then you go to South Side of Chicago, whereas people want to make fun of you. And I know because I have been the subject of this, for being country and Black and stupid and poor, but they're up there living impoverished on top of each other in these, either housing projects or really torn down neighborhoods. Nevertheless, but what they did want to do, while this was an experiment, and of course the SNCC people were overseeing, the kids weren't by themselves or anything, but they did this because they wanted to demonstrate that the same man who was, and this is a quote, the same man who was on the back of all Negroes, North and South, was the same man. And thereby they were hoping will forge a sense of unity and underscoring the national character of the freedom struggle. If we can get to the root of what's happening in both these places and how none of us are living comfortably, or with basic human rights, clean running water, clean neighborhoods, sanitation workers actually coming in, picking up the garbage, sweeping the streets, and people having the right to have homes with electricity and access to schools in their neighborhoods, we'll never be able to really push forward. We don't have to have the same exact ideas, but we need to understand where each other's coming from. So the school that SNCC tries to develop, they bolster awareness. Okay, students discuss things like police brutality in the South and in the North, African identity, because this is a time where African Americans, who I feel like we are always treated as different from everybody else in the diaspora. Well, yeah, we're the only people in the Western Hemisphere who were chattel slaves, who after chattel slavery was over had to actually live intimately with their oppressors in the same country. Like Jamaicans become the majority because the British leave. Haitians become the majority because the French have to leave. Brazil, the Brazilians who are formerly enslaved become the majority because the Portuguese have to leave. But it's not like that in the United States. They debated protest strategies, whether nonviolence, and nonviolence, to be sure, the majority of people that embraced it really did it because it was a strategy. All right, and I can talk more about that later. But anyway, the program collided with the realities of inner city life. And so these debates were healthy in really understanding what's going on. Now, why am I even telling you this? Because education to me is the key. And one of the things that Black people did was they began to create their own schools where they dealt with these things. Okay. So when we talk about teens speaking up, one of the things teenagers pushed organizers to acknowledge the philosophical and practical inconsistencies of nonviolence. Because what's happening is with nonviolence, they seem to get emboldened. And the federal government has helped, supply them with tanks and military weapons, to suppress any sort of blowback. But they also can continue to be violent against Black people, and the response is different in Watts and in Detroit and Chicago when they riot. They get to riot, but many of them are killed by the police in the process. And they weren't sure after watching this as kids of the 60s into the 70s that this was the way to do it. And one of the SNCC staffers did make it clear to the kids that, look, this is a tactic we really use only in front of the television cameras, because this was the rise of international media. This was all strategic. Anyway, instructors recognize, though, the challenge they face transplanting the idea of the Mississippi Freedom School, where you would teach your kids about their education, so on and so forth, renting out different community centers like this one, or churches. They realized that that model wasn't necessarily going to work in urban centers like Chicago, New York, Philadelphia. So when they went into the South Side of Chicago talking about freedom, which to Southern kids, Southern Black kids, when they heard freedom, that meant the right to vote, the right to education, eating where you wanted to. Their reality was different. But freedom to kids, above the Mason-Dixon, meant getting out of the ghetto on the South Side of Chicago. And you don't get out of the ghetto with nonviolence. And so they're dealing with this, but the point is they're bringing Black kids together to learn about themselves and their history as they go back and forth. They want to make sure that they're establishing something institutional to help Black kids despite all the politics going on. Okay. So anyway, there was an anti-poverty initiative under the control of Head Start, which we see being defunded and has been defunded over the years, and reduced. But the Child Development Group of Mississippi basically helped enable Mississippi's poor Black residents to exert greater control over the destinies of their children while addressing their desire to direct their own lives. They wanted to be able to, yes, hear the voices of parents and also provide resources for education. So one of the greatest examples of this, or the most well-known, is that when members of SNCC organized the Atlanta Project. The Atlanta Project assembled to imagine a new program of urban freedom schools. Their plans reflected the critiques that would encompass the idea of Black power over your politics. And politics meant actually having Black people in positions of power who represented Black interests and not just simply had a Black face, catch, all right? And education, all these other things. So one of the activists in there, Bill Ware, he says this: our experience has taught us something about this country. It lies. In freedom schools, we intend to tell it like it is, to get down to the nitty gritty, and to tell our history and the country's history. Boom. All right, freedom school applicants come to the real church. This lets you know how involved the church was. So I know people talk about the church and trash the church. A lot of the people running churches are also false prophets, which is turn people off. Okay. It's not because the real churches don't exist, but I think crowds like to go to, BS shows. But I'm going to say that. So from freedom schools to liberation schools, this is what we start to see a shift. And people don't talk about this as much because we see the outright street protesting and activism, which is necessary. But this is critical. So the man in the picture, his name is Charlie Cobb. So participants gathering now saw Charlie Cobb's original 1964 Freedom Schools prospectus, where he was saying, hey, this is what we should do. It became largely irrelevant to them, okay? Whereas Cobb had thought Mississippi schools as, anomalous, organizers now believed that Black Americans across the country faced equally contemptible systems of education. It didn't matter where you went. That if it was a Black neighborhood where Black people lived, they were the most under-resourced, under-financed, poorly paid teachers, and textbooks that are outdated, and none of which affirmed the African American. So in 1967, they decided to kind of change and shift to something known as liberation schools. And there's quite a few of these. And I say this because these people do not start out with a lot of money. They do this in an attempt because they see a need and they figure it out from there. So in 1967, did you know, the Nat Turner Liberation School was founded in Nashville, Tennessee, okay? They supplied a new model of autonomous, that means individual control, okay? Autonomous Black education, and provided further evidence of the scale of the oppression that SNCC faced, okay? Because SNCC is doing this to ensure a form of education for Black kids. So it was kind of modeled after the freedom schools in the sense that they were independent, but different in terms of their goal. So the venture had a lot of Black power sensibilities. Its classroom featured maps of Africa, and its instructors stressed that nonviolence, quote, only works because there is a threat of violence, end quote. All right. So math, basic reading, crafts, and swimming supplemented the political aspects of the curriculum. Another reason why African Americans parents welcome this project. Yet officials within and beyond Nashville, they obviously, you know, they're always watching Black people. Okay, mounted a concerted effort to portray the school as virulently anti-white, because back, you know, because everywhere else where schools are anti-Black by not teaching Black history or making Black kids uncomfortable in white schools by treating them like they're invisible, mistreating them, and all the other things. See, that's okay, but this is anti-white. How can we have this? All right. Anyway, so Nashville's police captain testified actually before the U.S. Senate Judiciary. Why the U.S. Senate is this concerned? Because anytime Black people lift themselves up and they get in the uproar, that's how you know you're doing something right. Anyway, so a Nashville's police captain had testified in front of the U.S. Senate Judiciary, which received support from one of the city's anti-poverty agencies. And they said this taught hatred of the white man. Brooks defended the school, okay? He defended the school and its personnel, declaring, quote, if Black children become angry when they learn about the white man, that is not my responsibility. So there were conservative congressmen looking to discredit poverty programs because they were like, see, they're getting funding. They're getting funding to hate us. Because the fear is always that Black people would ultimately do to white people what white people have done to Black people, even though they tell us that they treat us so well and they don't know what we're tripping about. They started to depict Black militants as instigators of urban insurrections, continue to vilify the school. Now, this is just a small school in Nashville, Tennessee. Federal agents targeted. Like I said, this is not a North-South thing. Racism in the federal government and the use of racism to destroy institutions has always been present. So targeted the establishment as part of a government campaign to monitor and disrupt Black political activists, also known as COINTELPRO. All right. So the persecution of Nat Turner School. All right. So, William Ware, okay? Bill Ware, that was the guy I quoted before. All right. So persecution within Nashville intensified. They start going after, they always want to get the big fish, right? Who's this Black guy who's educating these kids? So administrators of the local community in Nashville, their action agency, made no fewer than 18 visits to the school in a vain search for signs of impropriety, anything they could think of, right? So the Nat Turner School started facing growing pressure. The Episcopal chapel that had hosted the school finally evicted them from the space. Like I said, freedom schools were really built like, you know, churches offering this or whatever as a space. But this particular Episcopal chapel just got exhausted. You know, I guess they were friends to the struggle and then they decided not to be. And Bill Ware was arrested and charged with sedition in connection with statements he made about the need for Black people to acquire power by any means necessary. He's arrested for that. Now, the Klan, you know, had and still has a presence. Well, they call them Proud Boys now. Anyway, so eventually the displaced school was forced to convene in a public park. And this is what I talk about when I say resisting. They, you know, trash Bill Ware. They try to keep him from, you know, they kick him out of the Episcopal school. They keep freaking going. Because as long as he had a mind to work, and as long as there were kids to educate, he kept doing it. So they moved this into a public park. They pay taxes. All right. So they move it into a public park and a facility from where the authorities promptly removed. When they found out that he had moved the students to a public park, they took the benches out, picnic tables, trash cans, all of it, just the basic needs. And the liberation schools survived for the moment. That fall, in a display of defiance, its faculty staged the Nat Turner School's faculty staged a skit based on Nat Turner's 1831 slave revolt. All right, where they killed, I want to say, approximately 60 white people. A production that required students to pretend to hack white slaveholders to death, which did happen. As the brief life of the Nashville institution really suggests, the shift from freedom schools to liberation schools marked a critical transition. While freedom evoked the civil rights ideals of equality before the law, liberation implied an uncompromising embrace of self-rule. All right. In this process, Bill Ware was arrested, like I told you. So when people say, "Oh, we don't do our own stuff," and this is one of the things that frustrate me about Black people, because they always generalize this based on their individual section of Black people they know, or because y'all watch these bootleg ass documentaries. I don't care if it's Spike Lee or anybody else. That people who don't do research, and they'll tell you, "Oh, see, we didn't build our own school. Oh, we did that once in a while." Yes, this is the active destruction of a Black institution educating Black children. The burning down of towns like Quakertown, Texas, and you should really look that up. Quakertown, Texas, and all these other communities. We have to realize that was purposeful. And when you burn things down and you destroy them, like the wildfires in California, for example, it's going to take those people a long time to get that stuff rebuilt. You burn down a whole Black community where education has been purposely limited for even the teachers that get through this while they're overworked, then you get this kind of stuff. And so here's just a little excerpt from Jet Magazine. I found this on my own. Into the Park after the eviction. And they basically talk about the 10 children reenacting the killing of the white Virginia plantation owners. And they were like, although whites have accused school instructors, Mrs. Nancy Woodruff, Fred Brooks, director, and Larry Brown of teaching the preschool and elementary school youngsters to hate whites, they denied the charge. They say whites teach U.S. children about how Americans massacred Indians, and they were merely teaching Negro children about Negro history. History they do not get in school, added Brooks. If history teaches them to hate white people, that's white people's problem. Look, I'm just giving the facts. Now, what they analyze from that and what they get from it ain't no fun when the rabbit got the gun. But anyway, I say this to say, even when you're put out, even when people try to shut you out, and I know there are consequences, I have experienced them myself, in terms of where I've worked and had to leave. When you go against the grain, there are people that hate you and will try to destroy, blackball you, try to destroy your employment opportunities. But I can say this because I know it for myself, even though it was horrible going through those things, God has always provided. I've always been able to pay my rent, take care of myself. I've always been able to eat despite it, even when I was insecure about, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna land something, what am I gonna do? God has always provided. And I say that to say this is something we need to keep in mind. There are a lot more schools that I've researched and put in this, but I know people don't take as much interest in Black history as they should, but I'm gonna put this up anyway. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye.